Hi CURIO friends, today we're going to be using and working on the fall sign paint kit. So once you open up your kit, you want to make sure you save the gray paper so you can put that down as a messy mat. You'll notice that you have everything inside that you need to paint with, all of the different colors. We've included paper plates as your palette for mixing colors, and we've also included a paintbrush for you. If you would like a wide range of paintbrushes in different shapes and sizes, you can always feel free to stop into CURIO and we have those for you to purchase at any time. Once we start painting, you will also need to get a cup of water and a paper towel for yourself as we're working. But this kit is a little different because what you'll notice on most kits is that when you flip it over, there's an image drawn on it. But today, you are actually going to draw your own image on your canvas. So you can either work right on your canvas, or you can use the piece of paper that is supplied in your art kit, and you can work on drawing your image on here first, and then we can transfer it over onto your canvas. Canvas has a little bit of a texture to it, so it can make it a little bit more difficult to erase. So if you're worried that you might need to practice your drawing portion many times, you might want to start with your paper first. You'll also need a pencil and an eraser, because let's face it, we'll probably make some mistakes. This paper is really similar to the same size as your canvas, so you don't have to worry about making it too big or small. Think of this as your canvas, and that will help you to kind of think about how large to make your picture. So what we want to create is a really large pumpkin. We're just going to see part of it kind of peeking in from the canvas, and then our background is going to be a really cool buffalo plaid for today. So we know that pumpkins tend to be round, but one thing we need to remember is that no pumpkin is perfectly symmetrical or exactly the same as another one. So please keep that in mind as we're drawing today. So I want my pumpkin to be really large. I always like to draw big. I'm going to go a little back on my pencil so that I can make sure it's nice and light. The lighter you draw, the easier it is to erase. So especially if you're going right onto your canvas, you can make sure you draw light. If at any time I'm going too fast, please feel free to pause it, rewind it, whatever you need to make the timing work for you. All right, let's get started. So I'm going to actually start near the middle of my canvas because I want my pumpkin to be really large and kind of coming in from the edge. So I'm going to make my pumpkin kind of coming in from the side. And I'm drawing really lightly, hopefully dark enough that you can see. I'll darken my pencil line just a little bit. So I'm going to draw kind of this half of a circle shape, but I don't need for it to be perfect. I do want it to be pretty big, and I want to make sure that it comes off the edge. So as I'm coming around this side, I want to make sure that I'm kind of bringing this, instead of straight down, I want to bring this in a little bit so it helps to make it look like we have those ridges of the pumpkin that are oh so important. So I want to make sure that this kind of curves inward, not too far, or else it makes it look kind of like a heart shape, but we want to go in just a little bit. So I'm also, now that I have this coming in a little bit, I'm going to make this side kind of come in a little bit also. Instead of being so straight up here, I'm going to make my pumpkin come in just a little bit and kind of bend down off the paper a little bit so that it has a little bit more of a roundness to it. And you can either erase any of the lines that you don't need, or you could leave them and just make a mental note that you're not going to trace them once we get onto our big paper. So you're making a shape that's kind of like this. Your pumpkin's kind of poking in from the side, and even if you're drawing on your canvas already, don't make it too dark. So we kind of have a shape that's kind of a half circle shape like this. I'm actually going to put my stem, instead of up here at the top, I'm going to put my stem a little more in the pumpkin so that we can see a little bit of the back of our pumpkin and a little bit of the sides also. So we want to make sure that our stem is kind of a rectangle shape, and we want to make sure that it makes sense with the size of our pumpkin. So if you're making a really large pumpkin, then you'd want to make sure that your stem matches it. You don't want a huge pumpkin and a little tiny stem. You want it to look balanced. So I'm going to make my stem have a little bit of a curve in it. I'm going to start into my pumpkin just a little bit because your stem grows up and out of your pumpkin. And I'm going to make kind of a curved line like this. And I'm also going to make a second line that is parallel to my first line. Parallel means that we're trying to keep the same distance of space in between. If it's not parallel, then you want to make sure that it's at least wider here than it is at the top. So we're going to do something kind of like this, trying to follow that same line that you made here. We're trying to make the same line again like this. Since your stem is in front of your pumpkin, you can feel free to erase this middle line. And I want my pumpkin to have a more of a 3D look to it. I want to try to make it as realistic as I can. So in here, I'm going to make a little bit of an oval shape instead of just coming across and connecting this. If I make a shape that looks a little bit more like an oval or an ellipse, then it kind of gives it that look that our stem has a thickness to it, helping to make it look a little bit more realistic. And you could keep this really simple. You could just kind of round this off at the bottom. One thing that I like to do with it is give it those pieces that kind of come down and connect into the pumpkin that's kind of growing up and out of it. So I'm actually going to take my line and I'm going to make this kind of vein looking shape where it kind of comes down, and it's going to be small where it comes to the end, and as it goes up like this, it's going to be a little bit wider where it connects to the rest of my pumpkin stem. And you can do that a few times if you want to. This is completely personal preference on if that's something that you'd like to do or not, or how you go about it. I'm going to do one more that kind of branches off this way and connects up. The key is to make sure that this comes to a tiny point, makes it a little bit thinner. And then I'm also, because this has a thickness to it, I'm going to make one that's kind of coming out from the back like this. And this will look really neat once we start to do all of the different shading with it. It'll really make it come to life. Because right now, even though we have the ellipse, it's a little bit more flat looking or a little static. And one thing we're also gonna have is a lot of greenery coming up and out. So if this doesn't feel quite perfect for you, some of it will be covered by some greenery that we have sprouting out of our pumpkin. So now we have kind of this shape that's coming down into our pumpkin. We have a really nice stem. I think I'm going to, instead of making these lines come into my pumpkin very straight, I'm going to just give it a little bit of a bend inwards like this to make it look like it's ridged. And then this is where we would start to add some of those pieces and those lines to help make our pumpkin look a little bit more realistic, and it'll really become realistic once we start to add the shading. So what we're kind of looking for is a shape that kind of is more like an eye looking shape. It kind of comes down like this. So I'm going to make this line kind of coming down this way, like this, arching down. And this helps to make it look rounded. And then I'm also gonna do something similar. Let's see, maybe coming out this way and rounding down. The idea is that this has an imaginary point right here, this reaches together, and then it would kind of bend out and back down. And even though we can't see it, we know that if we continued it, it would kind of reach a point down here or maybe even over here. So that's kind of the idea, that we're getting this arched look to it. This is a really big area, so I'm actually going to make another line. This is going to be an area where we can do some more shading a little bit later on too. And then I'm also going to do another line from over here, so it's a little bit more symmetrical, and it has those nice ridges that looks a little more pumpkin-like. That's actually the only thing that we're going to work on drawing on our paper. Everything else we're going to attempt to do with our paintbrush, and I know you'll be able to follow along and you'll be really wonderful at it. So one thing that I have in my art studio that some of you might have at home, it's a little more old school, is carbon paper. So what I could do is I can actually take my canvas, I could lay down my carbon paper like this, and carbon paper has this black area that's full of carbon, so when you push down, it will show your pencil line so that you can see it. So I can kind of line this up on my canvas, and I could push my picture down. So if you're someone that has carbon paper, or if you ever even come to our studio space, we do a lot with carbon paper because we like our students to hand draw their own images and then come back and paint them themselves too, or do it in one class depending on how long it is. So if you have carbon paper, that's something you can do. But let's face it, most of us do not have carbon paper at home. That's something that maybe isn't considered a necessity in your art studio. So let's say you don't have carbon paper. Well, one really easy thing you could do is you could actually flip your image over, and you could take your pencil, it can be any kind of pencil, but you can take a pencil, or even if you have charcoal, and you can hold your pencil on the side and you can create your own carbon paper by putting this extra pigment down onto your paper. And you can either do it where you see lines, or you can do the whole entire thing, but don't be afraid to put that on pretty dark. And then you'll do the same thing. You'll coat this whole backing with your graphite, and then you can push down onto it, and that pencil marks, like all this pencil, will have the same effect. It will push your image on for you. And it's not perfect, it's just enough to kind of show you where your things are gonna be, because we're gonna do our background first. So if you're, doing this whole entire background, you're kind of using more paint than you need to, because this area is going to be something totally different anyway. And if yours looks different than mine, that's fine, because every pumpkin in the pumpkin patch is different. So that's a good thing. So we are going to start with our background. These are the colors that I took out of my palette for the background. So I'm going to use kind of this lighter brown, a cream color, not your white, this creamy color. I'm using gray, a little bit of black, and I have one of the darker browns. If you want, as we're working, an even darker brown, you could always mix your brown and your black together to create a darker look. So you can do your background with a very small brush. It obviously will just take you longer, and that's fine. I'm going to use a little bit of a wider brush. I'm also going to use this when I do that buffalo plaid, so I have these nice big long strokes through it. And one thing that I recommend is, while we're doing our background, make sure you paint the sides of your canvas too. It always makes your project look like it's finished already and ready to hang up if you do the background and the sides of your canvas at the same time. So we want this to almost look like it's wood and have more of a distressed look to it. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking some of our brown, and we're going to kind of choose a direction. Sometimes when we paint, I tell my friends to kind of overlap and make these X's, but if we truly are trying to make it look like we're actually painting on wood, you're going to want to either choose to go up and down with your paint, or you could choose to go side to side. But whatever you do, try to stick with that the whole time while we're painting today. And I'm actually first going to coat this. And remember, try to get your sides. I'm going to try to coat this first with my lighter brown. Everybody's going to be a little bit different with how they want to go about their project. But I'm going to get that side done first. And oh my goodness, it is okay if you paint into your pumpkin a little bit, but the reason why we drew it and put it on there first is so that you kind of know where you stop at. So you don't need to continue painting the entire canvas if you know that this area is going to be your pumpkin and your stem. So I'm going to put this lighter brown on first. Sometimes we mix colors as we're going. We will absolutely do that as we get closer to creating your pumpkin. We'll be doing a lot with shading, and we want to do that with your pumpkin while your pumpkin is still wet. But for the background, we're gonna do a little bit more of a dry brush look to it, which is a really neat technique that I like to use. And you can use it with any kind of brush, but I'll give you a couple little pointers with what kind of brush I like to use it with. So we know that wood has many different shades to it. So we're not necessarily worried about making it look perfect because wood grain is so incredibly unique and diverse. Everyone's can look a little different, and you, based on what you're doing with this, you might want to put it in your house. So you might want to have a certain look to your wood grain. You might want it to be darker. You might even want to make it look lighter. Like our home has a lot of grays and whites to it, so I might even want to give this a look like it's almost been whitewashed a little bit. But the first thing we're doing is we're coating that canvas with your light brown. And remember, if at any point I'm going too fast for you, that is fine. Just pause and come back to us whenever you're ready. One thing some people get very frustrated in is seeing brush strokes. That's totally normal to be able to see brush strokes. But since you can, that's why we're talking about going up and down, so that when we see those brush strokes, it gives the illusion or the idea of wood grain. So here's a couple of different things you can do for your wood grain. You can mix in some color while this is still a little bit wet. So what you could do is you could take just a little bit, if you want to, of this brown, little bit, tiny bit, because it is dark, so it'll take over really well. And you could work in a little bit of this dark color in a few areas, and you actually don't need to go over it many times, because the more you go back and forth over that, it's gonna blend in and look like one color. So I actually put a little bit on the corner of my brush, and I put a little bit on that part. If I flip my brush over, I can kind of put a little bit in another spot, and I'm just gonna go over it just enough that it's not dark. I'm gonna get a little bit more. So I'm going to go over it enough that it's not quite that dark, and we can see where my paintbrush ended. But I don't want to keep going over it so many times that it starts to completely blend into a different color in the background. And you can do this as many times or as little as you want to. This would be adding your color in while your canvas is still wet. You could also choose to let your canvas dry completely, or you could hair dry it and you could do more of a dry brush effect. What dry brush is when you take a brush and it's really, really, really dry, hence the word dry brush. Believe it or not, for dry brush, I like to use brushes that are stiff and brushes that are old, brushes that have been around a while and they don't even have like a really nice point at the end of it. But let's say like this spot right here looks pretty dry. Let's say I want to do some dry brush. I would actually take my brush and I would take off some of this paint. So I would actually like wipe a lot of it off. So my brush is really dry, hence dry brush. And then I could kind of scratch my paint on a little bit, and it's really hard to find that balance between like getting enough and getting too much, because you don't want to get too much that it's really dark, but you want to get just enough that it has a little bit of a streak to it. And the cool thing about doing this with dry brush is that it really makes it look kind of streaked and a little harsh, like how wood is. This has a little more of a soft look to it. But then if I do dry brush in some different spots, you don't have to do it everywhere. It just has a little bit more of a roughness. Like it gives that idea that you could possibly get a splinter with it. And don't be afraid to get close to your pumpkin. We do need your background to go right up against it so it looks like that's in front of it. So this is dry brush. When you're doing your dry brush, it's really important to make sure that you're still going in that same wood grain look. And if you notice, like I'm obviously very comfortable with doing this, but if you do it like this, it might not have the same effect as if you do these really long strokes. You know, think about it being a really long plank of wood and you're trying to make it look realistic. And that's okay if you go into your pumpkin. We'll paint over it with pumpkin colors, so it's all good. And you can absolutely, if you want to, you could work in some of the lighter color too. Like I said, if you have like a house that's a little bit more like ours is, a little more like modern looking, not a lot of natural wood, but lots of grays and whites with it, then you might choose to do this with more of a white and gray kind of tone to it. You could work in a little bit of that white if you want to. I am, just a tiny bit. I actually haven't even washed my brush the whole time. So I'm gonna do some dry brush with this too. I'm just gonna work in a little bit of this here and there. Just adds a little bit of depth to it. Our dark is our shadow. The lighter spots is our highlight. Try and keep those long brush strokes. Don't start to do anything like circles and X's and stuff. Keep it those long planks, that long rustic barnwood look. I'm gonna do a little bit more right where the top of my pumpkin is. Awesome, and don't be afraid to step back away from your project, because even when someone's viewing your work, they're not gonna be this close to it. They're gonna be back a little bit from it, so you could prop it up and look at it from further away and make sure that it's something that you like. You can absolutely do that. So you could either let this dry, or you could choose to dry it with a hairdryer if you want to. You could pause it and be done for the day, but I want to do one more step to do our background so that it's kind of totally finished for today. And I'm going to be using this really big brush. So what I'm going to do is wash it really, really well. You can absolutely do all of this with a small brush. It just takes longer. Make sure you wash your brush really well, pushing it down against the water container you have. And then you also want to dry your brush. You never want to take it and pull it, but instead you want to have your paper towel down and you want to just kind of brush it back and forth. You want to always keep those bristles together. That's super, super important. You know what, actually, I think I'm going to be done for today and just let this dry. We'll work on our background. We'll add the buffalo plaid in, starting with part 2 of our video. If you have any questions or concerns or need help with anything, feel free to email us. You can always look under our social media pages. And if you want to, you can always give us a play-by-play of what you're working on by tagging your picture and tossing it onto social media and tagging us at CURIO Cool. See you back here for part 2.